近几个月来，英国政坛一个接着一个爆出很多与中共渗透相关的事件，从国会内部疑似间谍案、伦敦皇家铸币厂超级大使馆的安全疑云，到突如其来的被撤销的间谍审判，这一连串现象让人不得不怀疑中共对英国体制的影响到底有多深。同时，北京透过制裁英国议员、经济施压与舆论操作等手段，试图让英国在对中政策上自我审查。今天我们要深入探讨这些问题的本质。我们特别邀请到英国对华议会联盟 IPAC 的执行主任 Luke de Pulford， 他长期关注中共对民主国家的渗透，也是推动英国对中政策转向的关键人物之一。Mr. de Pulford, thank you so much for agreeing to take part in this follow-up interview. There's been a lot of concern, not only just in the United Kingdom, but among allies, including the United States, about how Britain is handling the growing challenge of China's espionage and influence. I'd like to ask you about some of the key areas that have raised both legal and strategic concerns here. Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS, recently dropped the trial against two men that are accused of spying for the Chinese Communist Party. And many observers, me included, were surprised, especially after the summer's changes to the Official Secrets Act. These changes were supposed to tighten national security protections. And what does this collapse of the case actually tell us about how the act is being interpreted in practice, and how seriously the United Kingdom government now treats China as a state-level threat rather than just a competitor?
Okay, well, this is quite a big question because there are lots of fairly complicated legal details which are worth trying to explain to your listeners. The first thing is that the Official Secrets Act is a very old piece of legislation. It's from 1911 and it's really obsolete and had lots of problems with it. Until 2023, it was the only piece of legislation under which people accused of espionage, like these people were accused of, these two men, it was the only piece of legislation they could be charged under. But it has real limitations. The offence in that old piece of legislation is that information needs to have been passed, which could be directly or indirectly useful, to an enemy. That's what the legislation says. So this is framed in early 20th century terms, in terms of thinking about states as adversaries and enemies, and it's not really appropriate for dealing with diplomatic relations in the 21st century.
Yes.
So this was a known problem with the Official Secrets Act, but it's the only legislation there was at the time that these guys were charged. So they were charged with that offence. The difficulty was always the enemy word. In previous cases, it had always been difficult to establish that the country who had been assisted with information was an enemy. But in 2024, after these guys were arrested, there was another case, a very important case. It was basically the Crown versus Rusev, which is a Bulgarian spy ring. And they were accused of spying on behalf of Russia. And in that case, there was an argument over this enemy word. The Defense Council for the Bulgarians tried to say, an enemy means a country at which we are with war. That's what the defense tried to say. Therefore, they can't be guilty because they didn't pass information to an enemy. They just passed information to Russia. We're not at war with them. They're not an enemy. Therefore, the case fails. What the judge decided in that case was that an enemy meant any other state that presented an ongoing national security threat to the United Kingdom. So that was the case law. And here's where this gets very murky and very confusing, because all the UK government needed to do to establish this case was to present evidence suggesting that between 2021 and 2023, China presented an ongoing national security threat. And there is ample evidence to suggest that.
It did.
And nobody who has even a passing familiarity with these issues would dispute that. Yet, the government did not provide that evidence, and the Crown Prosecution Service took the very unusual step after the collapse of this case of writing a letter where they say that. They say they asked for months and months, and it was clear that no evidence suggesting that China was an ongoing national security threat would be provided by the government. This gets really murky now because there have been reports that the National Security Advisor, working with Treasury officials, decided that they wanted to shut down this espionage case, and putatively that they wanted to do that because they were worried it would upset China. So that was reported in the Sunday Times. Yesterday in the House of Commons, the Security Minister, Dan Jarvis, denied that. They blamed the previous Conservative government for not having a clear enough vision on China, for not saying that they were a threat, for not labelling them a threat. And they've also now decided to blame the Deputy National Security Advisor. So for your viewers, this would be the official whose job it is simply to give evidence to court on behalf of the government. They've blamed him, which seemed really remarkable and highly implausible, the idea that ministers or other more senior officials did not know about this. It doesn't make much sense. So this is not over by a long way yet. What I would say now, though, about our legislation is that it has changed. So we now have the National Security Act, and the National Security Act was really prompted by the deficiencies in the Official Secrets Act. So we don't now need to establish that the country that people are alleged to have been spying for was an enemy. We just have to establish that information has been given to a foreign intelligence service.
So was the information provided or not?
Well, the government did not provide evidence to suggest that China was an ongoing national security threat. But what the Crown Prosecution Service alleges about this offence, and we have to be very careful because these guys have not been convicted in a court of law, but what the Crown Prosecution Service alleged was that 34 reports were commissioned of these two guys by a Chinese intelligence agent, and it's even been reported that those reports, some of them, found their way into the hands of Kai Shi, a very senior Politburo official. In fact, some have even said Xi Jinping's right-hand man. So really remarkable turn of events, really worrying for those of us who work in and around Parliament, because we're feeling like anybody who may have been spying for another state between that period of time simply can't be convicted for what they were doing.
Yeah, like you just mentioned the case with Russia, and Russia is attacking one of the United Kingdom's allies, Ukraine, and what has been going on in the United Kingdom during these years when Russia started the full-scale invasion. It's also probably a very important question to look into. Do you think that there is a risk that political caution, or basically fear of offending Beijing, is overriding the very intent of all the national security legislation in the UK?
Yes, indeed, and I think that there are many examples of that, not just in this case. We call this preemptive self-censorship, and it's unfortunately a function of Beijing's very assertive and bullying posture on the international stage. Because they seem to be so assertive with their threats, you find that among many in the diplomatic community in major democracies, they are preemptively self-censoring what they might do for fear of upsetting Beijing. We've seen that in the UK in a number of areas. In fact, even back in 2021, when we were running a campaign to try to prevent the United Kingdom from engaging in free trade agreements with countries that were perpetrating genocide, and we had in mind what was happening in the northwest of China to Uyghurs, in that period of time, we knew that discussions within government were trying to work out which course of action would upset Beijing the least. That seemed to be the thing that they were most worried about. But there have been loads of other reports which I think also correspond to the same kind of behaviour. For example, China is not in the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. This is, again, new legislation, 2023, under the National Security Act, which seeks to categorise state threats and force certain people to register where they are seen potentially to represent a state threat. This was legislation designed by then Security Minister Tom Tugendhat to address China and especially the threat from United Front organisations. China is not in the enhanced tier. Russia is, Iran is, North Korea is, but China is not, very conspicuously. Well, why not? I would say it's for fear of upsetting Beijing, especially when there are ongoing trade negotiations between the UK and China, as there are right now.
Wow, that's very worrying, because the United Kingdom is also a part of the Five Eyes network. Do you think that this decision to drop the case and the fact that China is not being considered a threat or a challenger could undermine trust between allies? Recently, it was in the news that the White House, they are very concerned about the current case. Do you think that this would make them start seeing London as a sort of a weak link when it comes to counter-PRC operations?
There's certainly that concern among many in the security and intelligence community. Clearly, intelligence sharing between the United Kingdom and the United States is of crucial importance to our security. The United States is our closest ally, and it's I think, fair to say that their intelligence gathering operations far exceed the United Kingdom, so we really need that help. There were some concerns that were raised when Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, was made ambassador of the United Kingdom to the United States. He's had to resign in disgrace recently over the Epstein scandal. But the reason concerns were raised back then is that Peter Mandelson has been very well known to be very closely related to China. I mean, he's been heavily involved in discussions with Chinese officials, other Chinese organizations. He's been in many meetings with various United Front linked members. And the concern was, well, this is a guy who, through his political consultancy, Global Counsel, has actually had Chinese state-owned enterprises as clients. Surely that's going to raise a question about the security of intelligence sharing. And we know that those concerns were raised stateside. Now, if you combine that with the UK not even being willing to defend its own national security in an espionage trial for fear of upsetting China, that's the accusation. If you combine those two things, then you could understand why there would be people in other major Five Eyes democracies saying, what's going on with the UK? Like, are they a trusted partner? And that's a real fear for us, certainly those of us who regard ourselves as patriotic Brits. We do not want our key allies to think of us in that way.
Now let's talk about the so-called mega embassy, which is also related to that case, mega embassy at Royal Mint Court. Security experts have flagged the redacted and grayed out sections of the blueprints. Currently, it's again all over the news, and the reports are mixed. I've seen that currently the decision regarding the mega embassy is being delayed. You just told me that it should be on October 21st. Could you just also update the viewers on that? And from your perspective, what minimum level of transparency and security oversight should the UK demand before approving or maintaining such a site? And should this project even be allowed to proceed under the current conditions with those grayed out blueprints? We don't know what they're going to build there, right?
Well, thank you very much for the question. This has all become a bit confusing because we've already had one delay regarding the decision on the Chinese mega embassy. It was supposed to be decided on the 9th of September. That has been delayed to the 21st of October, and it was reported recently that it would be further delayed. We understand that the government is actually sticking to the 21st of October. That's what they said yesterday. But only this morning, the new Secretary of State, Steve Reed, said on the radio that he would make the decision within weeks. Well, the 21st of October is next Tuesday, so goodness knows what's going on there, Stan. I mean, I'm not really sure. I would tell you if I really knew. At the moment, we're expecting the decision on or before next Tuesday, so this is really imminent. The broader picture around the embassy, the redacted rooms, is this. The former Secretary of State, Angela Rayner, before she resigned, wrote to the Chinese, and she said, we would like to know what all these redacted rooms are for. And the Chinese replied saying, we are not telling you. And moreover, here's a legal opinion to say that we don't have to tell you. And the EU, the Secretary of State, can lawfully make a determination on this embassy without knowing. So that's their position. We're not telling you, and we don't have to tell you. You make the decision anyway. The concern about those redacted rooms is that although normally in an embassy building you'd have one or two, there are loads in these drawings, many where the uses of the rooms are not made clear on the drawings, and that's a fairly new thing. We didn't actually know that a number of months ago. So this has all come to light, and people in government are concerned about that. The top planning lawyer in the whole of the United Kingdom, a guy called Charles Banner, Lord Banner, produced a legal opinion which was sent to the government saying the Chinese have refused to explain these rooms. Not only that, but there won't be secure and safe access to the ruins which are underneath Royal Mint Court. And on those two bases, the government cannot lawfully give permission for the embassy. So I agree with him. I think it's true. I think the situation there is not one that the UK could lawfully proceed with. And if they do, they will find themselves facing what we call a judicial review. So if the government makes a decision, it's possible to review that in the courts. And if we review that in the courts, I think the government's in really hot water. Because the other thing, Stan, is that under our planning law, which is very restrictive in the UK, for a called-in application, that is, an application which has been reserved to the government to make the decision, the government cannot even have the perception of partiality around it. They have to assess it in a quasi-judicial way. They have to look at the planning law, the facts, and make a decision accordingly. There's a lot of pieces of evidence to indicate that they may have given the Chinese government assurances that they would get their embassy. And if there's a judicial review, that will come out. And if it is established that they gave assurances to the Chinese, anyone involved in that in the United Kingdom government will have to resign. So this is really serious for the UK government. They've got to now choose between their own stability as a government, potentially more resignations of senior ministers, and upsetting the Chinese, which is the lesser of those two evils. And I don't envy them that decision.
Well, and it's also a historic site. I've been there this spring. It's right next to the Tower of London. And of course, as you said, that there are ruins down below. And I think that those historic sites basically have to be protected. You shouldn't just give them out to a country with very shady records to be a little bit milder to them. Do you believe that Parliament has been given the full picture of what's actually being built there, or we still are in the grey?
Definitely not. And we know that that's the case because the government is still denying the presence of sensitive cabling infrastructure underneath Royal Mint Court. They're still denying that. And in fact, yesterday, by implication, the Security Minister described those reports as nonsense. These are reports that have been independently stood up by the BBC, the iPaper, the Sunday Times. I'm losing count of the number of journalists who have managed to stand up that there is sensitive cabling infrastructure running under that site. I do not know.
Look, one second, and it's just on the way between Canary Wharf and the city. Like all of the sensitive infrastructure, it goes just, it is down below there. It goes under the Royal Mint Court, right?
Yeah, directly. And we're talking like sensitive fibre optic cabling, which connects Canary Wharf with the City of London. So they're not being transparent about that. And I really don't understand why, because it's so widely reported at this point. But also, I think that the government has not been clear about what negotiations have taken place around the embassy. Remarkably, it was reported last Sunday in the Sunday Times that there had been discussions over the debt or the compensation that might be owed to Jingye. I don't know if your viewers followed this, but Jingye did own British Steel, so our really final remaining major steel plant in the UK. And they ran it into the ground and it had to be nationalised. This was a huge controversy in the UK. Because it had to be nationalised, there was an argument over whether or not they would be owed compensation for all the money they had invested. And it was reported that there had been discussions between Jingye and between the UK where they had said, we will give you your embassy if you forgive us the compensation owed to Jingye, which is a remarkable thing because apart from anything else, Jingye is supposed to be a private company. But it shows that that's a bit of an illusory distinction.
Why is the government involved in that? Yeah.
Well, they shouldn't be, but as we all know, I think when it comes to foreign investment in critical infrastructure, there's no such thing as a truly private company within China. So clearly, this is very murky indeed, and I think all of those stories, all of that evidence needs to come out because people need to make an informed judgment over just what discussions have been had over this embassy. The UK should not be negotiating away its national security in that kind of context. And if it did so in the context of the embassy, that's clearly unlawful, and the government will face consequences for that. Let me say something, Stan, just about the ruins, the access to the ruins, because this is really confusing for people. And I think it's important to understand. Everybody has heard of Westminster, but almost nobody has heard of Eastminster. The ruins of Eastminster are the Abbey, the Cistercian Abbey, which is directly under Royal Mint Court. So this is the site that the Chinese want to develop into a new embassy. They will effectively be in China for the purposes of the law. So it will be Chinese diplomatic land. Back in January, this was flagged by the Foreign and Home Secretary. They wrote to the planning inspector, who was sort of assessing this in an earlier stage. And they said, we're a bit worried here, because visitors to those ruins will not be able to get emergency help if something goes wrong. Let's say someone has a heart attack and they are visiting those ruins. The emergency services will not be able to enter without permission from the Chinese ambassador. It was also said between the lines in that letter, and this will be interesting to your viewers, if dissidents were to visit those ruins, what would be there to prevent them from being simply taken by the Chinese authorities. The UK police could not enter. That's a very serious risk.
If a Hong Konger goes or a Uyghur person goes,
Precisely.
there have been cases
Precisely.
like that.
And against the backdrop of Bob Chan being dragged into the consulate in Manchester and beaten up by the consul general in Manchester, and letters that are going out to Hong Kong dissidents saying, we will drag you into the embassy. This is a real risk. This is not made up. So the Chinese responded to that and said, we are not going to do anything about this. Forget it. So a month or so ago, about 6 weeks ago, when Angela Rayner was still Secretary of State, they wrote back and they said, we really need something to be done about this. And now there's a kind of fudge where the visitor centre will not be Chinese diplomatic land, but the actual area where the ruins will still be Chinese diplomatic land. So it doesn't solve any of those problems. And I think that we have a real issue there because it's not safe. I mean, people like me or sanctioned parliamentarians or others, if we want to go and visit our cultural heritage, if we want to go and visit Eastminster, we are going to be running the risk of coming into contact with, well, frankly, PLA soldiers potentially, who will do whatever they want with us.
Or Chinese police, which is no better. No.
Well, and there's nothing at all that the UK government can do about it because of diplomatic inviolability. We think that's an unacceptable compromise.
Wow. And finally, let's talk about another murky area, another kind of diplomatic pressure. Because China has sanctioned several UK MPs and recently hinted that the sanctions might be lifted if the right conditions are met. At the same time, Beijing continues to use economic and political pressure to influence the United Kingdom. How do you think the UK can inoculate itself against this kind of coercion while maintaining a principled and values-based China policy, which is what the current Labour government is also claiming?
Well, I don't think that I ever would have believed that I'd be saying this, but I think we need to take our cue from the European Union. If we look at the way that Ursula von der Leyen is approaching China, it's from a much more staunch position of strength and defensive values, and it's much more clear-eyed about the threat. So this policy of de-risking, and I think some of the rhetoric around China, has been much stronger than in the UK. I mean, we are still the only country among our major democratic allies that has not imposed tariffs on electric vehicles from China. We are going to become a dumping ground for Chinese EVs, and it is going to defenestrate what little remains of our car industry. And this is very clear. Well, von der Leyen hasn't taken that approach. Interestingly, also in the European Union, a deal seems to have been done there about the sanctions on EU parliamentarians, which were also lifted. But please note, in the EU, it was proposed that their sanctions would be lifted on Xinjiang officials, which had been imposed in 2021. And the EU said, no way are we doing that. We are obviously not going to make some kind of equivalence between the sanctions that you have wrongly imposed on our members for standing up for human rights abuses and the sanctions we imposed on the people who actually perpetrated them. There's no equivalence there. So the EU stood firm on that. I think they've made other concessions, but their sanctions got lifted. In terms of how we can inoculate against it, this is a tough question because I think the ultimate reality is that we have to try to break this dichotomy that seems to exist in people's minds between national security and economic prosperity. In the UK, we're still labouring under the misapprehension that China is going to rescue our economy. And we still have a £40 billion deficit in trade with China. We're not as dependent as other countries. Not only that, anybody who's really studying this will be able to tell you that China doesn't really do foreign direct investment in the way that they did previously anymore. It's been dropping off a cliff since 2017 or possibly even slightly earlier. So why is it that we think we're going to get this great economic boon from China such that it justifies, compromising on our national security? So I think that we have to work hard to break that. I think it's quite important to get economic analysts out there to say, we don't understand what evidence the UK is basing its approach on because there isn't any evidence to support it, or at least the evidence is very weak. Now, Stan, I think while it's true that China remains a large economy, it remains a big export economy, and we import a lot of stuff from China. That's correct. It's also true that those things, for the most part, can be got from elsewhere, and that our trade deficit means effectively that really they need us more than we need them at this point, certainly in terms of the trading relationship. So I believe that the UK, rather than marking itself out as kind of the weak link among our democratic allies now, needs to stand firm with them, needs to have discussions about auditing and reducing our dependence on China in areas of critical infrastructure, and making clear that there are red lines that we will not cross. The other key thing about this is that we know that Beijing likes to threaten a lot and does threaten a lot. And we also know that its bark is much worse than its bite. I think that if the UK had a bit more backbone and was willing to tough it out and say, well, Beijing may not like this, but this is what we believe, then I think we'd be in a much better place. Unfortunately, because of this culture of preemptive self-censorship that I mentioned earlier, they don't seem willing to do that, but I'm really hoping that we move into a stronger place after this scandal.
Basically, the de-risking policies that currently the EU is implementing, and the United States, they're harsher and faster in terms of de-risking and even decoupling from the CCP. Well, Luke, thank you so much for these insights. And it is clear that Britain currently is at a crossroads between commercial pragmatism and defending democratic integrity. And I hope that you make the right choice. And for everyone, please don't forget to follow the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. All the links will be in the description below. Thank you. 那么非常感谢 IPAC 的 Luke de Pulford 接受访问。他提出的警告正是当下英国最需要思考的。英国站在一个关键的十字路口，要么正面迎战中共渗透，要么继续用接触跟模糊掩饰威胁的现象。当在英国间谍横着走路，皇家铸币厂的蓝图被私底下出卖，政府文件仍然不敢直言中国是威胁，这些都反映出来伦敦对北京仍然存在着一种制度性的恐惧。但是呢，如果英国不在此时刻画下清楚的界限，英国、澳洲、加拿大等盟友将自行行动，而英国可能会成为整个民主阵营中的薄弱环节。如果想了解更多 IPAC 的调查跟报告，介绍栏里面有相关的资讯。喜欢这种内容的影片，请帮我按赞、订阅跟留言。想赞助的话，在这里影片下面会Patron跟应援科技这两个网站的链接。我是思婷，下次见。